Mental Testing and Intelligence Theory, Alfred Binet. History of Psychology, Psych 182, Professor Michael Botwin, California State University, Fresno. Alfred Binet was one of the first pioneers to use psychological tests to assess the intellectual capacities of children. He was tasked by doing this by the French government because resources were not being equitably distributed by the National Education Department. What was going on was that some schools reported that all of their children were doing exceptionally well and did not need any special education. But some of the school districts in the rural areas of France discovered that if they reported high levels of children with what was then called mental deficits, they would receive substantially more money than the French government to help their children get up to task. So these outlying schools started vastly over-reporting the number of children that needed help. And the French school system was kind of getting stymied with all of these requests. So Binet was charged with fixing this problem, coming up with a test to fairly ascertain whether children needed any kind of extra help in getting their education. So as you can see in this map, Paris is up at the top here in the center, and Paris had a great deal of wealth, so they did not need to tap into national resources for educational monies. In the provinces, where life was rural and there weren't a lot of resources, there was a great need for more money for education. So the administrators in those areas began to game the system so that they would get more resources from the government by stating they had a higher need by having more children with special education needs. So Alfred Binet comes along, and he's the first one to conceptualize the direct study of cognitive abilities. And many of the things that Binet developed are still used in psychological tests to this day. With Theodore Simon, he studied intellectual deficiencies in French school children. Later, his tests were brought over by Louis Terman and restandardized for Americans. Terman will be in a later presentation. Later, Binet and Simon developed an intelligence test using what was called age-graded task. In other words, what was an appropriate skill for a child to have of a certain age. The original Binet-Simon scale consisted of 30 tasks of increasing complexity. Let's look at some of these things. The easiest of these could be successfully completed by all children, even those who were severely retarded. Some of the simplest test items assessed whether a child could follow a lighted match with his eyes or shake hands with an examiner. Naturally, these tests were administered one-on-one. Most normal children could complete those relatively simple tasks by age 2. Slightly harder tasks required children to point to various named body parts, repeat back a series of 3 digits, repeat simple sentences, define basic words like house, fork, mama. These tests were usually passed by children of a normal 5-year-old age. Binet and Simon set the pace for testing intellectual abilities in French school children. Their use of tasks based on the mental and chronological age of children were to affect testing and testing theory far, far into the future. In fact, in many tests that are still administered to school children, they're deemed in terms of these notions. So you might, for example, have taken a test when you were in K through 12 that reported your, for example, reading ability. And if you were in the 5th grade and reading at the 8th grade level, you're performing ahead of the pack. If you're a 5th grader reading at the 5th grade level, then you have average intelligence. And if you're a 5th grader performing at the level of a 3rd grader, you're below task. So these types of strategies for testing still are being used. And to this day, funding based on performance on tests for school children is an important component of many funding plans for education. So, that's all for now. Bye.